All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm all set up and ready to go here. So this is the fifth lecture in Unit 6. If you'll remember Unit 6, we're talking all about imperialism. We've already looked at the quote-unquote justifications for imperialism, but we've also looked at the responses to European imperialism as well. We've seen the direct resistance that took place in Africa and Asia. We also see some of the religious rebellions as well. We also do see the peaceful negotiations, and we went over those in previous lectures. In our most recent lecture, we went over the response to imperialism from Japan, and we saw how Japan sought to copy the West and how they eventually engaged in some imperialism and empire building of their own. Today, we're going to move away from Europe. We're going to move across the Atlantic Ocean, and we're going to look at America. That's why this is titled American Expansionism. For whatever reason, we don't usually use the term imperialism. We just say that America expanded. I think the reason for that is when we talk about imperialism, we're talking about Europeans mainly going somewhere else, going and getting on ships and going to a new land. This America expansionism is going to have some similarities, but it's not, some similarities to imperialism, but it's not necessarily going to be Americans hopping on ships and going somewhere else, so much as it is them expanding from the east coast of what we now call the United States all the way to the west coast of what we now call the United States. So we should see some similarities, but we'll see some differences as well. Let's go ahead and talk about our essential questions. Number one is, what were the motivations and justifications for European imperialism? Just in the same way that there were motivations and justifications for European imperialism, there will be motivations and justifications for American expansionism. And so we'll need to realize what those are. Number two, in what ways did societies respond to and resist imperialism? We're going to switch that up a little bit. In what way did societies respond to and resist American expansionism? So how did Native Americans respond to and resist some of the expansionist movements of the United States? We're going to skip number three for right now, because in our next lecture, which will be our last lecture of this unit, we're going to take a deep dive and a deep look into immigration and responses to immigration all over the world during this time period. Let's go ahead and begin here and just go ahead and get started. So this is a word that we need to know. I'm sure you've heard it before, maybe in your 7th grade U.S. history class, and you'll definitely hear it again next year in your 11th grade U.S. history class, but manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is that this idea that Americans, it was their destiny to expand from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. That was their destiny, and anything that they needed to do in order to achieve that destiny was therefore justified. And so what we see over the process of about a century or so is that the European settlers and their descendants are going to spread from the eastern part of the United States all the way to the western part of the United States. Now, there's much having to do with manifest destiny, and this word APUS, we go over all that, but there's at least a couple things I want to point out just for us to be aware of in world history. We're not going to talk about it in detail here because it's world and not American history. This one right here is the Trail of Tears. And once again, I'm sure you've heard of this as well. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which removed these Native American tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Seminole tribes, to reservations in Oklahoma. In essence, these Native American tribes were around here in this area and including Florida, and were forced onto reservations in the western part of the United States. What ends up occurring, and this is just kind of emblematic of what happens throughout this century in the 1800s, is that the United States, as they continue to push west, they're just going to push the Native Americans more west. So when the United States gets all the way out to Missouri, well, the Native Americans are going to be pushed to Oklahoma. And when the United States decides that they want to push all the way to, let's say, the Rocky Mountains, well, the Native Americans will be pushed to the other side of those Rocky Mountains. Eventually, as you know, you can look at a map and see, you run out of room. Eventually, the United States is going to push all the way out to what is now California. And obviously, they're going to need to find ways to deal with the Native Americans. What I'm getting at is that eventually you run out of room, and there's going to be actual conflict that needs to be had. This is where we get the Native American responses. So the first type of response is direct resistance. We have the American Indian Wars. It's a series of wars between I say the colonists, and yet That's probably incorrect. I mean, this is a continuation of the colonists versus the Native Americans that we saw all the way back a few units ago. Back in Unit 4, when we had the establishment of Jamestown, we saw that the colonists and the Native Americans fought against one another for land and resources. This is a continuation of that. No longer is it the colonists, it's now the Americans versus the Native Americans. So these series of wars occur for over the course of a century. Native Americans fight back. For the most part, the United States is going to win and going to take the land. We also see a very religious response in the ghost dance, and this is seen most evidently at the Wounded Knee massacre in 1890. So let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about what the ghost dance is. Think about when we studied the Zosa cattle killing, we saw the religious response. And part of that was this ancestor worship. The idea that Nangawusi put forward was if we do what our ancestors tell us to do, we will drive the white man out. That's similar to what's going on here with the ghost dance. The Lakota tribes, as well as other Sioux tribes, engaged in the ghost dance, in which would help them channel their ancestral spirits, the spirits of their ancestors. The spirits of their ancestors said, continue to do this ghost dance, and you will drive the evil white man out. And so at Wounded Knee in modern day South Dakota, many of the Lakota who were there, about 200 or 300 or so, began to do this ghost dance in order to drive the white army out. The American army at the time was shocked and horrified. They had no idea what this ghost dance was. It very much scared them, and so they started firing upon the Lakota who were there. Overall, I mean, the numbers vary a little bit depending on what source you use, but anywhere from about 150 to 300 Native Americans, mainly Lakota, were killed in this Wounded Knee massacre. Most of them were unarmed women and children, and even the men who were killed, most of them did not have guns either. So this is why we consider this a massacre. What we see here, what we're seeing here, are a couple things that we need to be aware of. One is the continuity. This is a continuation of the wars that started in 1607 in Jamestown. Second thing, the Native American responses are direct resistance, which does not work out for them, and the religious response, which also does not work out for them. As long as we're getting those big ideas here, then we're learning from this slide. Let's go ahead and transition here. So we've talked about how America becomes a land power. They continue to move west with manifest destiny, and they take the land from the Native Americans via war. But eventually, the United States has to become a sea power as well. What inspires them to do so? Well, this guy right here, Alfred Thayer Mahan, writes this book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. He's a historian, he's a military historian, and he looks back throughout history and he says every great power has a great navy. The Athenians back in 400 BC, they had a great naval power, so they were very powerful. The Spanish Armada, the British have a powerful navy. If we want to be a world power, which of course the United States does, well, then we're going to need a big navy. So now we're going to see how the United States becomes a naval power. We've seen them become a land power. Let's see them become a sea power. What we also want to keep in mind here is we're going to be talking about Theodore Roosevelt in just a second here. Theodore Roosevelt being one of the presidents of the United States, and you'll spend a lot more time on him next year in 11th grade. But Theodore Roosevelt has two major writings acting upon his thinking at the time. This is one of them here. Theodore Roosevelt was very much obsessed with military history, would have read this book, and would have been inspired by Alfred Thayer Mahan to become this naval power. But the second thing that's really weighing on Theodore Roosevelt is something we've already gone over. We looked at Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, that poem that we looked at all the way back at the first lecture. That was written to Theodore Roosevelt and obviously other Americans as well, telling them to take up the white man's burden, to engage in imperialism because it's the right thing to do, at least in the eyes of the British Rudyard Kipling. It's the morally right thing to do in order to save the savages from themselves. So both of those things are acting upon Roosevelt's mind and Roosevelt's thinking. We need to keep that in mind because that helps explain some of his actions. Let's go ahead and look at those actions. First off, we have the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, President Monroe says no European power can control any nation in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, after the American Revolution, European nations still wanted to control all of this land in the New World. James Monroe says, no, absolutely not. You guys stay over there in your hemisphere. We'll control our hemisphere over here. I'm sorry. Monroe actually just tells Europeans to stay over there. That's what he does. It's not until the Roosevelt Corollary that we talk about American control. We'll get into that in just a second. We also see the Mexican-American War under James K. Polk between 1846 and 1848. You'll spend a lot more time on this in U.S. history, but the U.S. is going to win, and that leads to the annexation of the American Southwest. So we're talking like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas as well. That's how the United States gets those states. They take them from Mexico. The last part here is the Roosevelt Corollary. A corollary is an addition onto something. Roosevelt is adding on to Monroe's doctrine. Monroe's doctrine says European powers, stay over there, stay in your own hemisphere, don't come over here. The Roosevelt Corollary says Europeans stay over there, the US will get involved for you guys in Latin America if the countries of Latin America are unable to pay their debts. So what we see here is Theodore Roosevelt walking around the Caribbean with these ships that say debt collection and all of these other things. What this shows is the Roosevelt corollary that not only is the United States preventing Europe from getting involved, the United States itself will be involved in the history of Latin America. And what we'll be seeing in Unit 8 is that the United States does get involved with Latin America, especially when there's the rise of communism. The US will involve themselves and they will try to prevent the spread of communism. That isn't anything new, and that wasn't anything to be unexpected because under the Roosevelt corollary, the US said, hey, we're going to get involved in Latin America. It's a justification to use military and economic force in Latin America if it benefits the United States. We're going to talk about Mexico here very, very briefly because we want to talk about Cinco de Mayo as well. So European powers were invading Mexico. Like this was a legitimate threat. And the reason they would do so is that the Mexican government was in debt to Europe and they wanted the Mexican government to pay off those debts. Well, eventually you get Napoleon III or Louis Napoleon of France, who realizes that this might be an opportunity for him and the French nation to try to rebuild their French empire in the New World. And so he installs Maximilian as emperor in 1864 in order to try to put French control over the land of Mexico. By 1867, Maximilian is going to be removed, and Benito Juarez is going to resume being president of the Mexican Republic. But during this battle, during this whole conflict, we do get Cinco de Mayo, which happens in 1862, in which the Mexican army defeats the massive and superior in number French army, thus showing that the Mexican army would be able to defeat the French, at least eventually. And this was a huge victory for them, and obviously a day of celebration as well. The United States did intervene, and that's another big point here, is that the United States is willing to intervene as long as it benefits the United States. What we'll see moving forward, especially into Unit 7, is that the U.S. is going to intervene into Mexico. Sometimes the Mexican government likes that, like with Cinco de Mayo. Other times, it very much greatly upsets the Mexican government. And this is going to play out in World War I a bit, but we'll talk about that more in the next unit. Big stick diplomacy is the idea of Theodore Roosevelt. His diplomacy is to go around and hit people with a big stick. He's going to go and do whatever it is that he wants. It's essentially saying, I'm going to use military power in Latin America in order to get what the United States needs. So what does the United States need? Well, they would really like a canal. They would really like a canal through Central America because that's going to explode trade. That's going to make trade happen. And more trade means more wealth for the United States. Unfortunately, Panama at this point is controlled by Colombia, and Colombia does not want to give the U.S. any sort of canal or canal zone in Central America. And so the US uses their big stick and they take it from Colombia. They inspire a Panamanian revolt and supply the people of Panama as well in order to overthrow the Colombian leaders. so that way the United States can eventually build the Panama Canal, as you see pictured here. There's a lot of history to the Panama Canal, but I'll save you guys from that, just so that way we can move on to other things. What we do need to know is that U.S. is getting involved, big stick diplomacy, Roosevelt corollary, and they create the Panama Canal in order to benefit themselves. And yeah, it does benefit the rest of the world as well, but obviously it's going to benefit the United States the most. We also see the Spanish American War beginning in 1898 and actually ending in 1898 as well. Spain still had a hold of some of the islands in the Caribbean during this time period. It was kind of the last part of what was formerly the great and powerful Spanish Empire. Cuba at this point is fighting for independence. And what occurs is that the United States, once again, under the Monroe Doctrine, under the Roosevelt Corollary, want the Spanish out. So they're looking for any reason, any justification to go ahead, help the Cubans and drive out the Spanish. Well, there is a U.S. ship, the USS Maine, in Cuba, and this ship explodes. Now, it probably exploded because of some internal reason. Something went wrong, something wasn't quite right. It was an honest to God accident and it exploded. However, the story that's told is that the Spanish blew up the USS Maine. This is an example of yellow journalism. Yellow journalism, and you'll talk about this more next year, is this idea that you could sell these sensational news stories, that you could heighten things up a little bit in order to make people really excited. Like, oh, the Spanish blew up the USS Maine is something that's exciting to read, and people are going to buy these journals or buy these newspapers, and they're going to read about it. It's a way to kind of sell a story. It's very similar to fake news, as President Trump likes often to put forward there. Fake news, and you can see examples of fake news all over, whether it's left wing or right wing. People heighten up a story, they appeal to people's emotions in order to sell that story. It's nothing new. It's the same thing as it was a century ago, which is an unfortunate part of history. We tend to repeat ourselves a bit. So what happens? The United States gets involved, kicks the Spanish out of Cuba. The US wins, and they receive all of the, not all of the, but most of the former Spanish properties, namely Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. We're going to focus on the Philippines right here. See, the Philippines were also resisting the Spanish. If you remember, they were a Spanish colony going all the way back to the 1500s with Ferdinand Magellan. So the Filipinos are under the idea that they are going to overthrow the Spanish and then they're going to have their own independence. The Americans have other ideas. The Americans say, yeah, we'll help you overthrow the Spanish, but you're not getting independence. Think about it as being not independent, but under new management, because now we are the colonizers. We are the ones who are going to control you guys. This leads to the Philippine American War, which the United States wins. So now we start to see the United States engage in more of a European type imperialism. Obviously, there's going to still be resistance, but the U.S. will possess the Philippines until 1946. Why is this important for us? One, when we get to World War II, we're going to see the island hopping campaign, and the Philippines are going to be an incredibly important part of that as the United States approaches Japan during World War II. Second thing, in the United States, there, and especially in Las Vegas, there's a significant Filipino population. Why is there a Filipino population in the United States? Well, because the United States used to control the Philippines. So all of these things do have very long-term effects, as we've talked about in previous lectures. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up our discussion on American expansionism. Make sure you have your notes. In our next lecture, which will be our last one, we will spend it all talking about immigration and the responses to immigration.